Okay. Share screen. Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on a weekend for this kicking off or splashing off the first week of our Reef Spawn virtual session. All right, and this week we will start with conservation knowledge. We will have two speakers today, Dr. Louisa and Shantini. But for the first session, we will begin with Dr. Louisa first. All right. So Dr. Louisa is a marine mammal scientist with working experience that spans over 17 years, working at various locations from Oman, Thailand, Vietnam, and permanently here in Malaysia lah. She has co-founded MareCet, which is the first Malaysian's first and only NGO focusing on conservation of marine mammals and its habitat. She also have received a Pew Fellowship Award in Marine Conservation, and she's the first Malaysian to ever receive this prestigious award. In that same year, she was also allocated with Anugerah Perdana Belia Negara. All right, so this is a highest, I would say, award given to youth in Malaysia. All right, so she now is spearheading MareCet scientific research. And through her research in MareCet and her team, she wants to promote ocean literacy and aid decision makers in local conservation planning. All right, through MareCet as well, she has done a lot of training with the youth, especially in marine science and conservation. Hence, she's also here today. We are very fortunate to have her to spend a little bit of time despite a busy schedule to give some training to our young planule for this Reef Spawn program. All right, so without further ado, the reef is yours, Dr. Louisa. So I'll just stop sharing the screen and you may share your screen and over to you. Let's dive over to your reef.
All right, thanks, Chai-Ming, and good morning, everybody. So I want to say, first of all, congratulations to the Reef Spawn team for putting this program together. And of course, you know, for clinching the funding that made this possible. It's a real honor to be here, to be able to speak to all of you. And I hope that the program in its entirety will inspire you to do more for the environment and even for Malaysia in whatever that you're doing, and just inspire you to do great things. I think it's a real honor to be able to kick off the program today, and I hope I don't disappoint. I just want to say that it was nice to see that the participants were selected from a vast variety of backgrounds. So not everyone is just in science or marine science, but I'll say that I actually don't know anything more about you guys. So I don't know if you're still studying. I don't know if you're already working in your respective field of specialization at the moment. So just bearing that in mind, today's presentation was prepared. Today's presentation was prepared really as a very broad, generic content on conservation and science. So maybe you'll know some of the things already that I'm saying. Maybe it'll be new stuff for you guys, yeah? But of course, it's a very broad topic. I only have 40 minutes, so I'm gonna get started now. So I'm gonna share my screen. Right, can everybody see my PowerPoint screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Just need to put to.
Yeah, it's not going to slideshow. All right, there we go.
Slideshow, yeah. Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, cool. So yeah, anyway, so I prepared a talk, I simply called it Knowing What You're Doing and Doing What You Know. And maybe it'll become a bit clearer later why I named it so. but I was asked to talk about conservation knowledge and science, so how science feeds into conservation, and I decided to add in a little bit extra of some other perspectives and insights. Okay, so first of all, a little bit about myself. So as a, this is not, okay. As Chaiming mentioned, I've been doing research on marine mammals since 2004. And essentially what I'm doing today is living out a childhood dream that I've held since I was 10. So I've been doing this for quite a number of years. I focus primarily on small cetaceans, which are dolphins and porpoises. And since 2014, we've been doing work on dugongs as well here in Malaysia. And also we are starting up a project on large baleen whales here in Malaysia. So yes, we have whales in Malaysia. I'm also an educator for conservation. So through the work that I do, I ensure that a lot of this information gets out to kids and the general public where possible. But most importantly, I love dogs. So that's I thought I'd put it up there, important information about me. I love dogs and I have a few of them. They drive me crazy, but life is more colorful because I have dogs. So in 2012, I co-founded MareCet, which is this local grassroots marine conservation NGO focused on marine mammals and their habitat. So we use marine mammals as a flagship taxa to promote conservation because they are iconic, they are sentinels of the ocean health. And also I found that there was just really little awareness about the fact that we have marine mammals in Malaysia. Even till today, people are in disbelief that dolphins and whales live, year-round in Malaysian waters. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. So let's get into it. The two words which are the focus of today's presentation is science and conservation. And often there is a misconception that by default, science and conservation are one and the same, meaning if you're doing science, if you're a scientist, it automatically means you're doing conservation. Or if you're doing a conservation, it automatically means you're doing science. But that is absolutely not true, okay? They are two different things altogether. However, conservation needs science. So in order to do conservation better, in order to be able to make decisions, to make informed decisions, we need science. That's where it comes in. So doing science alone is science, right? You're a scientist and you're doing science. But there's a bridge, and we need to walk on that bridge to carry our scientific work across that bridge to do conservation, okay? So an example I show you here is this. This is an exercise where for one whole week, some years ago, a bunch of us were holed up in a hotel in Kota Kinabalu, using science to essentially identify important marine mammal areas for the IUCN. So all these polygons that you see on the screen were not just made by simply, drawing them on a map, or it wasn't made just from, oh, somebody told me the other day that they saw dolphins or they saw whales in this location. Okay, we draw a polygon. No, these maps and polygons, to identify important marine mammal areas was based entirely on available scientific data, of how many animals are there in an area, what are the core habitats, what are the threats, and etc. Yeah. So this was one example that I've been involved with, where I wanted to show you how science feeds into conservation. So just a little bit of background: marine mammal areas, important marine mammal areas, IMAs as we call them, they're not protected areas, but it enables us to form a basis to lobby for protection on the ground for these animals in our respective sites and our respective countries. Yeah, so science had to feed into that process, and all the data that was fed into into submission for this identification had to be peer reviewed by an international panel of reviewers to ensure that, okay, you have enough data to justify that this area is important. So next, let's just go back to basics. What is science? Okay, since we're talking about the word science so much. So I went to Cambridge Dictionary, our trusted source for definitions. And basically it says science is the careful study of the structure and behavior of the physical world. So the world that we live in, especially by watching, measuring, and doing experiments, and the development of theories to describe the results of these activities. Right? So basically we want to collect data on certain topics, and we want to analyze that data, and the resulting information that we get, we want to understand why are we seeing this result, or why did this result not come out instead, and what could be the causes for it, what are the things that drive the outputs that we have obtained from our analysis. So just put simply, that's what science is. And just to note, of course, there is a very broad range of science fields out there. Today, my presentation will largely be linked to the science that I know best, which is marine science, which is a form of biological and natural environmental science. But of course, there's all sorts of other kinds of science out there. There's physical science, chemical science, industrial science, etc. Yeah. And then what is conservation? So very often this word is misused and abused by lots and lots of different people. Sometimes just because we are sending our plastic bottles, for example, to the recycling center once a month, once every 6 months, some people might say, okay, they're doing conservation. Yes and no, but essentially conservation is the protection of plants and animals, natural areas, and interesting and important structures and buildings, especially from the damaging effects of human activity. Okay, so this is a very broad definition, of course, because there's many ways that people can do conservation. So, but it's also, what I'm trying to say is that, no, not to discount people who think of themselves as conservationists because they're sending their bottles to the recycling plant. But what I'm trying to say is that conservation is often, how to say, not thought of in its broadest and fullest sense. There's a lot more that meets the eye than what most people just think what conservation is. Okay, and I'll touch a little bit more about that later. So broadly in conservation, there are sort of 3 categories of conservation that we can do. Okay, one is related to species or taxa. One is related to ecosystems conservation. So for example, so with species, we could be protecting turtles, sharks, lions, elephants, frogs, etc. Ecosystems mean the habitat in which these wildlife live. So seagrass beds, coral reefs, rainforests, mangroves, etc. And then we also have conservation at the local community level. So in many parts of the world, let's take marine conservation, for example. There are many coastal communities that live all along the coastal areas of the whole world. And in many of these cases, a lot of these communities they struggle with economic livelihood, or they live very simple lives. Sometimes there are environmental changes that have come about, in the environment that they live in, and they notice the change, regardless of what the issue is and what has caused it. They notice these changes, but sometimes they are not in the position to help themselves because they don't know how to. So local community conservation is in one way efforts to understand how local communities can enrich their lives, and how scientists and conservationists can assist them in achieving shared conservation goals that can help them be resilient and sustain their livelihoods and their lifestyles where they are. So for example, here I will use an example of the work that MareCet is doing. This is an example of science in species conservation. So our aim is to protect and conserve marine mammals here in Malaysia. And one of the things that we are currently doing is trying to understand how underwater noises are impacting the welfare and behavior of dolphins. Right, so we've got dolphins in the picture here, and we've got our hydrophone in the water to collect data on these underwater noises. So when a boat approaches, we record, whether the dolphins are whistling or clicking. We record whether there's a change in their visual behavior. And the idea is that we want to use this information to be able to make recommendations for things like boating code of conduct, or areas that are sensitive for a certain life history of the animals that we should consider protecting, that we need to recommend to the government agency to say, hey, this area is really important. The dolphins seem to be feeding here a lot, but a lot of boat activity seems to be disrupting that feeding. So we need to think about what we need to do. Okay, so this is one example of how science can be used in species conservation work. Next is how science can be used in ecosystem conservation work. I put this photograph here. It's just a arbitrary example of monitoring of a coral reef. Of course, this is the kind of work that Edmund does on a daily basis, monitoring reefs and using line transects to survey along reefs to look for species diversity, species count, coral cover, and things like that. But essentially, when doing ecosystem conservation, we would then collect data on things like coral cover or seagrass cover, forest cover, species richness, and looking at indicator species that give you information about the health of a reef, for example, or is it in decline? Yeah. So again, the data that is obtained from such research can be furnished into maps and statistically analyzed to show whether there has been a decline or an increase in the health of the reef, or like this one, for example, or has things changed? Has the community, the reef community, the reef assemblage, has that changed or not? And again, taking it to decision makers and saying, hey, my data is showing that this area is, we've lost 40% of the reef cover. We need to investigate why, but we need to start thinking about what we need to do because we're losing the reef quite rapidly. Okay. And then science in community conservation. I'm using this example from Indonesia. So this is my friend, the one on the right-hand photograph in the white t-shirt, my friend Raymond, who is a Pew Fellow. So he did a really cool work for his Pew Fellowship, where he helped really remote coastal communities in Indonesia, I think around the Wakatobi and Raja Ampat area. He helped train them to understand about how they are catching their fish. So they were finding that their fish catches were still okay, but then there was also little data to manage how they are catching their fish. So what he did was he created some apps and he gave them training on how to report their catch. So how to measure, what you caught, how to identify what you caught, and to put it all in a log. And he trained them how to use the app. He trained them how to just look for trends in their catch data to understand that, okay, if we keep catching fish the way we keep catching, then maybe this certain fish, which is important to us, is gonna deplete. So this is one way where he was trying to get them to understand that if they learn to fish sustainably, then they will have fish for many years to come, and that would sustain their livelihoods, especially in a remote area such as Wakatobi. And so he empowered them to do this, and again, if they found issues in the way they were catching the fish, then they would sit down and discuss, okay, what do I need to do? Maybe I need to change the type of gear that I'm using, maybe I need to change the mesh size of the net that I'm using, etc. So over time, it really helped build up this sense of ocean guardianship for their own area of fishing. So that's another example of how science can work in community conservation. Okay, so going back to science and doing science for conservation. So I started with saying knowing what you're doing. So what does that really mean? When we need to collect data to understand what's happening out there in the environment or in the topic that we're trying to study, we need to know what we're doing. We can't go in blindly. Of course, everything is a learning curve, but I think here are some sort of easy steps that we could follow to help our process of doing science. Okay, so first we want to understand the potential conservation issues. So first you want to select a site. Okay, site selection can happen in many different ways depending on what the situation is. So you need to select a site because you can't say that you're going to study an entire coastline or entire country or anything all at once, right? So select a site that is representative of something that you think you could do, an area of interest. Gather background information about that site. Who lives there, or what are the what makes the site what it is, and understand a little bit about its cultural history or socio-political background, etc. Okay, and then from there, figure out what are the potential conservation issues and anticipate possible scenarios of what could be the problem, or anticipate, you identified the problem in this area, but if nothing is done, then what could possibly happen? Okay, and what can you do as a researcher to try and address these problems and find solutions for it? Okay, then next, you will need to ask the right questions. So what is the problem, right, that you have identified? And what are the most pertinent information that you need to be able to do something effectively for change? Then next, you want to design your research and work plan accordingly, of course. And for that, you want to ensure that you expend sufficient effort when you're doing your research. So meaning you don't just go to a site, collect data, over a week or 2 weeks, and then make conclusions from that. A lot of times, conservation outcomes require enough data. Okay, there's also the argument that we can't wait for all the data in the world before we react, which is very true. But there is a bare minimum of information that we will need to be able to make robust conclusions and to push for positive action. So ensure to expend sufficient effort. Collect the right kind of data. Okay, in science, in research, there's nothing worse than having gone out there and not collected the right kind of data, to find that when you're back in the lab analyzing your information, that information is missing or not enough. Okay, so ensure that you're collecting the right kind of data to answer the questions that you have asked for your research. And of course, it's important to stay on top of latest methods, but to work according to your budget and your logistical capacity, right? Sometimes new methods are very high tech, maybe beyond our budget range, but sometimes latest methods can also help us make our work a little bit easier, to streamline things and make the whole process a bit more efficient. Okay, so just always check in with what's the latest, but it doesn't mean that old methods are wrong. It doesn't mean that old methods are no longer applicable. It really just depends on what we're doing. And the important thing is to plan accordingly to our research needs and capacity, but trying to tap in on tools and resources that are currently available to make life easier and to make the research more successful. Okay. All right, so activity time. Just gonna stop talking for a while and let you guys get to your whiteboard where Edmund will help me facilitate this. I talked just now about the 3 broad categories of doing science in different kinds of conservation settings: species, ecosystem, and community, right? And I talked about how when doing our research, we need to know what we're doing. And part of the process is formulating research questions to guide our research, okay? So I want you to put your thinking cap on, and we'll start with science and species conservation first, okay? Just off the top of your head, just imagine if you're a scientist working on a species, it doesn't matter, mosquito, frog, fish, whale, you know, whatever, birds. Think about what are some of the research questions as a scientist trying to do species conservation. What are some of the research questions that you could possibly ask? And there's no right or wrong answer, but just put down what you think, yeah?
Okay, for those of you who are in the Miro board now, you can go to the icon on the left. On the left toolbar, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's the number 4 is a sticky note. So click on the sticky note and you can start writing in your thoughts. Okay, start with species conservation, which is the box on the furthest left. So write down. So I've seen Priyanka has written down her thoughts. So maybe I read some of it for you, Louisa. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let me see.
I think it's helpful to share your screen at this point.
I can stop sharing mine, and or how do we want to do this?
Yeah, Edmund can directly share from here.
Okay, can also.
Can pause to share.
It's okay, I'll do it. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, one of the questions here, what are the types of species that exist in this area? Species that are most affected with the current change in the environment. Oh, here's a good one. How does economic, still typing, how does economic activity X in place Y affect the population of species? You can also see the screen, right, Louisa?
Yes, I just see a lot of cursors floating around.
Yeah, you just read the ones in the sticky note. So science that studies the different species. Yeah.
So, okay, maybe we'll give it another 1 or 2 and then we can circle back to the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Edmund, if it's too messy, you can actually hide the cursor's name.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll go back to my PowerPoint now. Yes, I'll continue. This one, share. Okay, so some good questions there. Good to see, you know, your thoughts. So I just wanted to show you, I prepared a list of questions as well. Again, generic questions that scientists working in species conservation would ask. And these look something like that. Okay, so some of these questions are questions we've actually asked doing our work on marine mammals here in Malaysia. So things like, what is the population abundance in a certain area? So this is one thing that decision makers always love to ask. One of the first things is, how many are there? And this is really a difficult question to answer. And sometimes we have to tell them that it's not so much about how many are there, but what are the issues that we need to first look at, and how can we protect the area so that the species can thrive. But certainly, what is population abundance? But it's also an important question to ask. It's an important analysis to do, because it's good to know how many are there. What is the habitat use and core habitat areas of the species in the area? So understanding how a species is using the area. Is it an important place for feeding, breeding, traveling, communicating? Then there are things like, what is the genetic diversity of the population? So in some cases, in endangered species, for example, their gene pool is so small that there is the issue of inbreeding and reduced reproductive fitness and reduced population fitness, because the genetic diversity of the population is small. So how can we do conservation bearing that in mind? Or what are the, as I mentioned just now, how are underwater noises impacting the behavior of the animals? Or how is water pollution impacting the animals? So these are examples of questions that we can ask that will help us with tackling certain conservation issues where we work. Okay. All right, let's go to the next one, which is the science in ecosystem conservation. So I'll pause my screen again. Chiming.
Yep, okay. So same process. Let's go back to the Miro board. Now move into the second box, which is the pink color one. Right, and start putting in your questions. So coral community, before and after community, presence of marine life. What are the main human activities in that area? Okay, that's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
What would the acidity of seawater affect the reef?
Okay, that's a good one.
What are the key indicators
Of health
Yep.
in an underwater
ecosystem?
ecosystem. Yeah. Monoculture issues, how to avoid it. Okay. There's one on the top left. I can't really see what it says.
How does the species interact with each other within the ecosystem?
Oh, okay. It's a good one too. Cool. Okay. So let me go back to the PowerPoint.
Yep.
To share. So those are really good questions. I'm glad to see you're asking them. So the questions that I've prepared as examples are this. So what is the value of the services provided by the ecosystem? What is causing the die-off of corals or seagrass, for example? What is the function of the ecosystem for fisheries resources? What is the rate of decline or improvement in the coral cover? And what are the effects of trophic cascade? So quite similar to some of the questions that the participants posed. So good. Okay. And last one. So science in community conservation. So we'll go back to you.
Okay. So same process. I'm just going to share the screen so that Dr. Louisa can have a look.
How can fishermen fish more sustainably? Okay, good. It's a good one. How does fishing tourism industry in Malaysia affect marine ecosystem? Okay. So I think the question, how does fishing or tourism industry in Malaysia affect marine ecosystem? That's probably more of a science in ecosystem conservation question. Is the current economic activity sustainable? Okay. Main target local people or authorities. So I see less people responding for this category because it's definitely how to say a less, I think at least in Malaysia, it's a less developed field of work compared to species and ecosystem work. Not to say that there's nobody doing it, but it's also not easy because it's a complex field of study. How to engage with the local community to work together, okay.
Yeah, this one is how to convince them to adapt to environmental friendly fishing methods. Yep.
How to convince, okay, the small one, all right.
Yep.
And what is being done to increase conservation knowledge? Okay, that's a good one. Any more before we switch back? What are...
Which method is best to share scientific information to the local residents?
Okay. I think that's probably a question for Yao Hua, I think in the comms session.
Yeah, the week 4 kind of session. Yeah. So remember this particular question, or maybe Yao Hua is taking notes now.
Yeah. So it's linked to science, but it's really about the approach of communicating that science. Okay, so I think, yeah, let's go back to the screen. Yes, continue.
Okay, back to you.
Yeah. Okay, so great. Some great questions. So the last one I want to share is here. So some sample questions that we can ask if we're doing science in community conservation is, how can the local community build resilience against climate change? This is one of the bigger topics at the moment within this field of study, especially in coastal areas, coastal communities and small island nations where sea level rise is a real hazard and concern. What are the influencing factors for conservation participation? So understanding how a community operates to be able to know how they would actually be agreeable to participate in conservation. And that kind of goes a little bit into the social science realm as well. What kind of approaches to alternative livelihood can benefit both communities and ecosystems? So often that people always think when it comes to conservation, only one side wins. But what if, actually we can work in a way where both sides can win? Maybe we'll win some, we'll lose some, but not just one side wins and one side loses completely. And of course, another example is, what is the willingness to pay amongst visitors to the marine park? This is something that deals with a bit about economics as well, to understand how can conservation be conducted better in a certain area. It can be a marine park, it can be within a coastal community that maybe charges a fee for being there, like in one of these locally managed areas. But to understand how much is it that people are willing to pay, and why or why not, and what are the drivers of those. And that can help, because let's say somebody says, well, I'll be willing to pay $100 a park fee to go to this place to have a holiday or to dive, but I expect that there should be good facilities for sanitation, for accommodation, etc., but also built in the most eco-friendly way possible for that area. So these are the kinds of things where we do research into it, we can understand how better to initiate those conservation activities. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in just getting our brain juices flowing of the kinds of research questions that researchers and scientists have or need to have when they are formulating their research to address a conservation problem. Okay, so next. So we went from knowing what you do, right, to doing what you know, okay? So what does that mean, doing what you know? So you're analyzing your data, you've collected all that data, you're analyzing your data. And it's important that you start looking for patterns in your data to be able to answer your research questions. It's important to create visualizations of that data for yourself, to be able to facilitate your thought process, to get your brain juices to start working about, okay, what does the results mean? And how is it going to help me with addressing the research question and the problem that I wanted to look into? okay? And prepare to break it down. Okay, what do I mean by prepare to break it down? Because the next part after analyzing your data, you get your results, you need to disseminate your results, right? Science is not for keeping to ourselves. Science is really for sharing for the world. So how do we disseminate our results? Okay, so who? So as scientists, most of the time, scientists will disseminate their results first to their scientific peers, you know, their colleagues, whether locally or abroad. But where working in conservation is concerned, you know, and that's where doing what you know is important, is that we need to also break down those results and simplify it without diluting the value and the message, so that we can talk to decision makers, right? So that we can tell the general public, we can talk to students, we can talk to corporate bodies, we can talk to anybody about what our work means. Okay, and why, what are the implications of these results that we're finding? And how do we do it? Where do we begin? So again, most of the time, scientists will disseminate their results first in journal articles, peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, and present them at conferences. But also we can break it down, you know, and make it aesthetically easy to understand by putting our results into reports, technical reports that we would give to decision makers, and of course social media, right? I'm sure all of you are on social media. Social media today is like the thing that people do. It's a very powerful tool. Of course, it's so powerful that it can do so much good, and of course it can also do, you know, a lot of damage if it's not managed properly. But social media really is a place where you can break down your work and put it into infographics, put it into blog articles, and you know, make short videos of your work and put it out there in a format that people can understand. Okay, so that's very important, is that doing what you know. So taking your results, what you know now from your results, and doing something with it. Okay, so finally, we want to take action, of course. As a scientist, let's say you're working in an area where you developed a novel method to address a certain problem, okay? But you only created this in your lab and at small scale, right? But it needs to be scaled up so that it can be applicable to you know, more people, and it can be really more effective to address the problem at large. So one of the things you can do is to pitch it to donors and to events and investors, so that you can scale up your product, you know, the results of your study, and to make it applicable widely. Next is to create special campaigns. So even as a scientist, we can create special campaigns around you know, our findings, and to lobby for those findings to be taken up where it matters, right? In government, in local communities, and etc. And of course, collaborative efforts. Collaborative efforts means you can work with other scientists to take this work, you know, into greater heights, you know, for better impact. You can work with media, you know, to make short movies, short documentaries. You can work with local communities to do something about what you're finding. All right. So I want to, take time now to shift gears a little bit. I've been talking about the scientific process and how to apply it into conservation. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit just to talk about jobs, scientific jobs for conservation. So thanks very much for your responses, you know, to my question, where I asked you, what do you think a scientific job is in conservation? You know, what are the kinds of scientific jobs that people can do in conservation? So you can see here, half of the responses fell under the category of scientist, right? But I was also very happy to see that there was a variety of other types of jobs that was mentioned. They're not all scientific jobs, but you know, it's a good variety nonetheless. And when I break down you know, the scientist category, you know, into the sort of individual responses under that, I found that most people said researcher, just scientist, environmentalist, ecologist, biologist, and of course marine scientist, where marine work is concerned. So this is not wrong, but this is it's a reflection of what I always say, that people have this common idea that to do science-based conservation, to be a science-based conservationist, first we must be a field scientist. And that's not wrong, that's totally not wrong at all. But I've also found out, in these years of doing this work, because I had that same thought too. I entered into marine science because I wanted to do conservation. Do I regret it? No. But in doing conservation along the way, in these, the last decade or so, I've also found that we can be so many other things if we want to do conservation. If we want to be doing science-based conservation, we don't necessarily have to just be field scientists. So for example, what are the other options that we can consider, where science is concerned? We can go into computer science. So there's a quote here from Dr. James Borrell. He's a conservation scientist at the Royal Botanic Gardens in the UK. He says conservation is crying out for coders, IT experts, and people who can come up with novel solutions to hard problems. This is very true. As we are discovering through the work that we do, there are days where we really need a coder. We really need someone to help us to come up with an app, come up with a software that will help make that processing of our data a lot more streamlined, a lot smoother. Things like AI is so useful in today's world where there are a lot of different problems and not enough time. So we can always think about things like computer science. So I currently have an intern, and she's about to go off to university, and she's deciding between computer science as a major or ecology and biodiversity as a major. So I said to her, why computer science? And she said because she saw through her internships that she's been doing how so many of us scientists are struggling with this loads, piles of data that we just can't finish processing in a short space of time. So she understood that something like computer science would be very useful in terms of helping conservation. Okay. Next is we could be wildlife veterinarians. Okay. In Malaysia, wildlife veterinarian positions are few and far between, but we hope that this can improve in the future. But being a wildlife veterinarian, for example, helps us look into animal husbandry, helps us understand emerging diseases within a species, within a wild population out there, and helps us understand what is happening and what do we need to do. Or we can be a geneticist. Often when we say geneticist, a lot of people will think, like a doctor or a researcher who's studying the human genome. But actually, there are a lot of scientists out there who are species geneticists. And part of the conservation work that they do is to try and identify conservation units through DNA. So earlier I talked a little bit about genetic diversity and how, if a population has very limited genetic diversity, it can lead to inbreeding and eventual extinction. So geneticists' work is also very important to understand, even though we may have, let's say, 100 animals in a population, but if their gene pool is so small and not diverse, then in the future, there could be a lot of problems that arise from that and which will lead to their eventual extirpation as well. Then, of course, there is social science and psychology. So this is something that I really learned along the way in my journey of being a science-based conservationist, is that social science and psychology is such an important topic within conservation, because success in conservation requires understanding of the human psyche. Why do I say that? Conservation problems are caused by human beings. Therefore, actually, to fix a conservation problem, we need to go to understand how people behave. Why do they behave in a certain way? Of course, there's a lot of other things that come into play, such as economics, politics, culture, but changing mindsets, changing behaviors, changing views on how people do things really links back to things like psychology and social science. And I've not heard anyone come tell me that they wanted to enter into conservation, so they're going to study social science. Most people are studying social science because they themselves are intrigued and interested in the human dimension of things. But I think it's worth to start thinking about, hey, I could go off and do a degree in social science or psychology because I want to be a conservationist for the environment. And there's also things like biotech and engineering, where we can create solutions for nature. There are a lot of people who are doing that, trying to find alternatives to single-use plastics and whatnot. But I think that more could be done, because we need to scale up and be able to make these alternative solutions to things that are not degradable. We need to make these alternatives affordable for the masses. So, you can think about helping the environment by entering into these kinds of fields where you can create something that will be, amazing and great for use, for everyday use on the planet. And of course, I can't, talk about the breadth of what kinds of jobs, science jobs that would be linked to conservation. But of course, there is so much more. But I hope that I've given you a peek into what are these other alternatives that we could think about when we want to do conservation and still remain in the science field. So,
Louisa,
yeah.
we have about maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
I think I should be, yeah, I'll speed it up. So
okay.
I just wanted to draw attention to a quote by Dr. Rosa Lee from Duke University in the US. So she's a neuroscientist, and she's talking about how decision neuroscientists have found that people are more willing to make sacrifices to protect the future if they can vividly imagine themselves in that future. So things like improving VR technology, and developing that and making it available for people to enter into a virtual reality of seeing the future could help with behavioral change. That's another example of how a field of work that you don't really think about could be also useful for conservation. And then here I just want to show you an example of a data scientist coming from an industrial field who is currently doing his part for conservation by helping us design a software that will help us streamline our copious amounts of photo ID data that we have to do for our research. Okay, so just kind of winding down a little bit, I love this slide. I always use it. It says, and I don't know how many out there are Star Wars fans, but it says, so you want to be a Jedi. What can you do to advocate your findings for conservation? So basically, it says that, advocating for conservation and environmental science simply means ensuring its results gets into the hands of relevant people in a format that is clearly understandable. It is communicating science to a wide and appropriate audience. Okay, I found this article in Science a few days ago, and first of all, I really like the artwork because it's I think it's very representative, and also I just want to quote some of the scientists who were asked how can their field of science improve conservation efforts. So just to quote Dr. Falco Bush from South Africa, he says that, because science is being dismissed quite entirely these days by society, we need to appeal to the public's curiosity by describing the way science explores and protects the undiscovered parts of nature. Okay, how can you put your science into work is by appealing to this public curiosity, right? So we're not just to produce more detailed research, but kind of really use it to get people engaged in the work that we're doing. And then Dr. Paula Tesanos Pinto from University in Argentina, she's talking about cyanobacteria bloom and how it's affecting the local communities where she is. And she says, to do this, scientists need the support of politicians and decision makers, who can invest in water treatment facilities. And to do that, we must foster awareness in the general public, about the causes and consequences of such blooms, and so that engaged citizens can promote the changes needed through adjustments in their lifestyle and also informed votes, right? So our vote matters. So just very quickly, I just want to show you examples of how our work at MareCet, we have used science to translate it into different formats for education. So we put our work out into different formats to speak to local communities, to young kids. We have outreach activities where we let them experience what it's like to be a marine mammal researcher, and looking through things like microscope, looking at plankton, baby seahorses. We've translated the science to train local communities to be better stewards of the environment. So we've worked with vet students, local fishermen, nature guides on, things like how do you handle a stranded animal? How do you release an entangled animal? How do you sample from a dead animal, etc. And of course, we translate a lot of our science into policies and plans that would help hopefully with development issues and planning locally. So just very quickly, again, thank you for your responses about what's the first thing that comes to mind when you say conservation. So these are the results where people said nature, conservation workers, restoration, turtles, education, protecting species. This is not wrong at all, but just to reiterate that truly conservation is a complex hot tangle, right? And it really involves multiple things. So, but again, reminding you that conservation needs science, conservation needs engagement with local communities and decision makers, policy planning, etc., economics, cultural aspects of the arena in which we're working in, etc. So, and I think you'll learn a lot more about this hot tangle of what is conservation as you move along in this Reef Spawn program. So just going back to science, I just want to put this little comic out there. What are you going to do? If you're a scientist, what are you going to do? How are you going to present your findings? And it appears that these days, one of the things that goes most viral is an internet meme involving cats. And so maybe that's what's needed sometimes to get the message out there. So I know I'm out of time. I just want to end by saying the proper use of science is not to conquer nature, but to live in it. And this was said by one Dr. Barry Commoner, who was a very well-known American cellular biologist and ecologist. So our science basically needs to be put to good use so that we can create a harmonious environment within which we can all live. Okay, so thank you very much. If you're interested to learn about what MareCet does, we are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and you can also check out our website. And that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Louisa, for the very inspiring and very, I would say, insightful topic on how science in conservation and what and the reality of conservation is. All right. So thank you once again,